Okay, so our future events this semester, a week from today, we have a discussion called Does Socialism Have a Future in the United States with Bhaskar Sankara, the editor of Jacobin magazine. On October 5th, we have an event, Does Conservatism Have a Future in the United States, with Patrick Deneen of Notre Dame and celebrated author of Why Liberalism Failed. On October 15th, we have an event, Do the Humanities Have a Future? The Liberal Arts Between Technocracy and Radicalism, with Ross Douthat of the New York Times, and that is our Lincoln Scholars lecture. On October 26th, we have an event, Does the Center Have a Future in the United States? Featuring Bill Galston of the Brookings Institution. So these are election driven with sort of deep background, deep thoughts on the election. And then after the election, we have one event, a kind of a post-election cleansing, I hope. That will be November 19th. Fashion, Identity, and Freedom of Expression with Gwendolyn Gruel of the New School for Social Research. I also want to call to your attention that we have a podcast. Tom Merrill and Sarah Marsh, our colleague in the literature department, have a podcast called Politics and the Humanities, and you can find that at Politics and the Humanities, all one word, .fireside.fm. And there are 3 podcasts posted already, Can the Humanities Survive? And discussions of Mill and Jane Austen. And they're going to have an upcoming podcast on Aristophanes. Our topic today is free speech on campus. And we are privileged and honored to have Professor Jonathan Marks of Ursinus College. He is a professor and chair in the Department of Politics at Ursinus. He has a BA, MA, and PhD from the University of Chicago. He has articles that appeared in the most prestigious political science journals, including the American Political Science Review, the Journal of Politics, and the Journal of American Political Science. He's also written for articles on higher education for Inside Higher Ed, the Chronicle of Higher Education, the Weekly Standard, the Wall Street Journal, and Commentary Magazine. He's the author of Perfection and Disharmony in the Thought of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, co-editor of Principle and Prudence in Western Political Thought, and his latest book, Let's Be Reasonable, A Conservative Case for Liberal Education, will be published in 2021 by Princeton University Press. So with no further ado, Jonathan, welcome to American University, such as it is, not, without leaving your home, you're still our guest, so welcome. And I'd like to begin our conversation by just asking you, overall, what is your take on the status of free speech on campus? And as a corollary to that, these days, free speech seems to be a kind of a code word for stealthy conservatism. So in talking about free speech, is this just some sort of conservative propaganda, or what's going on?
Thanks, Alan. Thanks for having me. Been very impressive lineup of events that you have, and I'm excited to be part of it. And I was glad to have a chance to talk to some of your students just a few minutes ago, an hour ago or so. Again, today you've got a good thing going here, and it's nice to see so many familiar names, if not yet faces, over here. I guess I also want to thank whoever was involved in publicity, who managed to dig up from the internet a 19-year-old photo of me. I used to think it was unflattering, but now I feel like I'm being caught as a Match.com liar of some kind. The photo now looks pretty good to me. So my take, no suspense, right? I don't think that there's a free speech crisis on campus. I think there is and has been for a long time a free speech problem. I think that we maybe magnify the extent of the problem for a couple of different reasons. One is just your standard, it bleeds, it leads kind of coverage from journalists, generally speaking. So if there's a protest, especially at the kind of college or university New York Times readers aspire to send their children to, then there's a reasonably good chance it's going to get noted, right? If on the other hand, you, Alan, teach a wonderful class on Edmund Burke, that's unlikely to be noticed. I didn't even see it in the Eagle when I looked. Larry Summers, former president of Harvard, who has some experience with what used to be called the problem of political correctness and is now sort of called the problem of cancel culture, said to Bill Kristol in an interview, and I'm paraphrasing, that what's going on in colleges and universities, despite right the political correctness of which he had some experience, was that students come to college, they take classes, they choose a major, they learn things, they're educated, they make friends, they meet peers, they decide what they're going to do with their lives. And he says that anyone who thinks that's not the main thing that's going on campuses is mistaken. And I thought that was an interesting comment coming from Summers, who had experienced some troubles when he was president of Harvard. And I think it's mostly true. I think also that there is a certain kind of anti-college propaganda effort, which I'm happy to talk about. I do think that there's a problem, right? That is to say that I don't think they're lying to you when they say that people are prevented from speaking on campus, either directly by protesters or indirectly by having their invitations rescinded. That's not fake news, right? And I don't think they're lying to you when they tell you that students in numbers are expressing opinions about free speech that make supporters of the First Amendment weep loudly into their pocket constitutions. That's not a lie. And I don't think that they're lying to you when they tell you that politicians sometimes get involved in the affairs of colleges and universities without freedom of speech top of mind. I just don't think any of it quite rises to the level of a crisis. And I think that we know less than we imagine about what's going on. Finally, just the rest of this take, I don't think that colleges are necessarily in the business of training up free speech warriors, and that they need to be thoughtful about speech beyond the freedom of speech versus censorship debate that tends to dominate the discussion about higher education politics. Now, is it a conservative trick? Well, let me rip off my mask and reveal Donald Trump. No, I think it's more liberal, right? In the old sense that governments are instituted to protect rights, and lots of people now think that that's a trick, right? So somebody on the left will tell you, sure, those rules look like they protect everybody, but actually they're gamed by the Zionist, white supremacist, moneyed oligarchs, right? And the right will tell you something like that too. Sure, those look like equal rules, but especially though not only on campus, right? They're gamed by the progressive, globalist, professorial, elite, Eastern, Western, California, New York oligarchs. So I think it's sort of a liberal thing in the sense I just described, and that some people think that's a trick, but I don't think it is really a trick. And maybe one piece of evidence of that is that these folks do tend to remember the importance of freedom of speech when they're under attack, and they go to court and try to defend themselves on First Amendment grounds. One rule that sort of applies everywhere, whether you're on or off campus, is that people will tend to think that suppressing speech is a pretty good idea when they think they have the power to do so, and will tend to think that's a pretty bad idea when they lack that power. And I think that even people with pretty firm ideologies in their heads will tend to pull that switcheroo.
Okay, so I heard you refer to several kind of contemporary practical issues, the disinvitations, the question of student opinion on campus today, and I want to talk about those. And I heard you also talk about some maybe deeper theoretical issues related to free speech on campus, having to do with the purpose of campus, the purpose of a university education. But first, I just want to ask you, you referred to a propaganda campaign against the universities on the question of free speech. Can you elaborate about that?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. And I'm not original in this, I don't think. That is to say that you have real free speech warriors sounding a kind of alarm about this. So you have people like David French, who used to be president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, right? And they're founded in 1999, and their whole line, right, is the defense of First Amendment liberty, free speech, religious freedom on campus. Greg Lukianoff is the current president of that organization.
Who is an AU undergrad, I believe.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, you turned out a good one, I think. And then also John Haidt, who's founded or co-founded a more recent organization. I forget exactly what year it came about, the Heterodox Academy, which was devoted to free inquiry. And if you look at the way they've been talking over the past couple of years, what they say is that there's kind of moral panic on the right concerning free speech, or questioning the conventional wisdom, as French puts it, that there is a free speech crisis on campus. And when you hear people like that, right, making that claim, which is a little bit like, you know, Colonel Sanders saying, let's cool it a bit about the chicken, everybody calm down, you have to have the idea that there's something up. And if someone has my slides, can I get the slide 3?
And before we go to the slides, can I just make sure I'm understanding what you're talking about? You're talking about two of the main organizations in the country that are the most vociferous in defending free speech. The leaders of those organizations have recently been describing conservatives as being a little panicked.
Right, and French himself is a conservative. I don't think either Haidt or Lukianoff would describe themselves that way. But and yes, they are all, you know, they've been prominent in the fight. In French and Lukianoff's case, legal, and Haidt and otherwise, and Haidt in the battle of ideas in the academy to preserve free speech. And over the years, they've certainly been worried about it, so that they're saying that, you know, as I said, no, slow down, whoa, that's a little strange.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
if I could get the third slide. Yeah. Maybe make it a slideshow, be seen a little bit better, but I think this is fine. So I follow Campus Reform on Twitter. It was founded in 2009. It's a project of the Leadership Institute, which trains conservative activists. And thanks to them, if I go to bed at 11 p.m. and I wake up at 6, ready for a day of irritable tweeting, they'll have 5 or 6 stories stacked up on my feed. And some of them will sound pretty tantalizing. California college compares conservative group to Hitler, right? You know, I'm drinking my coffee and there'll be this picture of Hitler, so that gets my attention. Yeah. But if you actually, you know, oh no, and then if you click through, what you find out is that one student of the 13,000 students at, I think it's Santa Barbara City College, made something like that comparison. Now, there is actually a real issue at Santa Barbara City College, which we can or cannot get into. But the concern of campus reform is primarily, first of all, how can anyone say that, right? And then an extension of that single undergraduate to the entire college. So like if you're an undergraduate at the University of North Texas and you write an op-ed in your school newspaper on manspreading, campus reform is going to be there. Or if you're an undergraduate at Princeton and you write an article in the school newspaper that says, you know, people are making fun of the way I pronounce Cool Whip, and I think that might be a microaggression, stop the presses. Campus reform is going to be there. Even if you were kind of a sleepy communications organization at a college and you publish a sleepy item about how some people seem to be offended by the phrase "okay boomer" while others aren't, right? Call up the editorial desk because campus reform is going to be there. UMiami warned students about using dismissive phrase "okay boomer." Well, I clicked through and the article contains no such warning, right? Now, why does this matter, right? It's just campus reform, but they've got more followers than some conservative magazines, the Bulwark Commentary, which I write for, so I'm very upset about this. They have about half as many followers as the National Review. And their stories get picked up. So the Cool Whip story that I just mentioned was picked up by the National Review, but even more preposterously, the OK Boomer story was picked up by Daily Wire, and then Ben Shapiro posted it. Ben Shapiro has about 7 million followers. So campus reform gets picked up. Sometimes, if they do a really good job, if they go onto the campus of the University of Virginia, right? And somehow or another, they managed to get 20 students on that vast campus to sign their petition, their fake petition, which says, we really want the University of Virginia to talk about Christmas less officially. Well, then Fox News might even put you on TV, right? And you'll have all of those viewers. And they're relatively clear on why they're doing this. And this is why I describe it as a propaganda effort, right? They're presenting an avalanche of information, some true, some not, designed to magnify the defects of colleges and universities. Why? Conservative students face constant abuse from their peers. It doesn't have to be this way. Didn't we elect Donald Trump? Right, so if you go onto your site, you can find that. That's how they attract donors. It turns out that Donald Trump agrees. So when he signed his 2019 executive order on free inquiry and other matters, he cited an incident at Berkeley, which for all I know was reported on by Campus Reform, I'm not sure, but was an incident in which one person not affiliated with Berkeley hit another person not affiliated with Berkeley on its 1,232-acre campus. But that requires federal action. So from the top down, to exaggerate the defects of colleges and universities, which like big tech and Hollywood just may be eating your children, is an ongoing effort. And speaking of eating your children, Charlie Kirk, the president of Turning Point USA, which is a major organization that bills itself as a conservative higher education reform organization, has chapters on many campuses, said just Tuesday, right? Again, this is a higher ed reformer who often speaks up also in favor of free speech, so relevant to our discussion. If we lose, if the president loses, they will come for us all. They will come for your children.
Right. Okay.
So that's what we're dealing with. And I think that's one of the reasons, by the way, Alan, that people sort of think this free speech argument, even though it is not a Trojan horse, might be some kind of Trojan horse.
Right. Okay. So those are several examples of organizations, I don't know, manipulating, misrepresenting, exaggerating for political effect. Is that a correct characterization of it?
Sure.
Right. Yeah. Okay. But that doesn't mean there are no problems. So you talked about there's not a crisis on campus, but there's problems. So could you, and you included the disinvitations and just mentioning of student opinion. So can you clarify what you mean? What's the difference between a crisis and a problem? And then let's talk about some of these problems like disinvitations.
Okay, so I think a crisis signifies a situation in which you're about to go past the point of no return, right? And in some sense, higher education will be to the point where you may as well take a torch to it and burn it down. That's what I would describe as a higher education crisis.
Okay.
A higher education problem means that there are areas on campus, neighborhoods, individual campuses, neighborhoods on individual campuses, in which you may have quite serious problems. Some of which I didn't even name in my introductions, and that could have repercussions for not only the quality of education, but individuals who may be targeted or fired, right, over views they have, or put through the ringer, or investigated, right, or what have you. So I think there are real problems, but I'm not convinced that we're at the point of no return.
Okay, and so those people, we've all heard examples of that. So, I don't know if I heard it from Campus Reform or somewhere else, and now I don't know whether it's, to what extent they're exaggerated or not. But so the examples are usually someone who says something that is deemed not politically correct, something that's insensitive with changing goalposts or landmarks of what is deemed insensitive, and they are harassed or fired, or right. So that kind of thing is real.
Yeah, I think it's real. I'll give you one example. It's from, it's from several years back now, but it wasn't that long ago. Over at Connecticut College, Professor Andrew Pessin, one of the relatively few Zionists on that campus, wrote something about, on Facebook, I should say. It must have been around 2014 because it was over the Gaza conflict that was occurring at that time. And the post, if you read it in context with even a modicum of care and good faith, what it was a denunciation of Hamas. And in the course of that denunciation, he compared Hamas terrorists to animals. One student or two took note of this, had conflicts with Pessin over other matters in the past, and tried to argue that he was a racist because he was in fact comparing all Palestinians to animals. Ordinarily, it might have ended there, but it ended up as an item in the school newspaper, and ultimately almost every academic department, so they're professors, right, many of whom knew Pessin personally, felt compelled, in part at the behest of the students in question, to issue denunciations, generally speaking, not by name, but clear denunciations of what Pessin clearly hadn't actually said, right, and publicize those. For a long time, they were sitting, you could read them on Connecticut College's homepage. So that's one instance of a case in which Pessin certainly wasn't fired, but he received death threats, and he eventually left campus on a medical leave and didn't come back for 2 or 3 years, I think. So things like that do happen.
So, but I mean, how worried about them are you? How prevalent are they?
Well, I don't think they're very prevalent. And quite often in the cases we're talking about, at least the professors are protected enough that it doesn't get to the point of their losing their livelihood. So you're really dealing with, at least in terms of the kind of situation I've described to you, I can think of 5, 6, 7, 8, over the past 5, 6, 7, 8 years. I'm sure other people could think of more. But, there's something like 4,500 colleges and universities. So I wouldn't say that kind of thing is prevalent, but I'm sure
what
it
about
must have a chilling effect on
Yeah,
speakers on campus at Connecticut College and places like that.
right. What about disinvitations? That's a lot in the news these days.
Yeah, well, I think that one reason people are concerned about speech on campus is because they see stories about people getting shouted down. Can I have slide 5? So we're looking here at Heather McDonald, although she doesn't normally have devil's horns. And she was invited to speak, and she actually at least arrived at the college in 2016.
And let me just interject for a second. We hosted Heather McDonald a few years ago, and she debated the virtues of capitalism with our speaker next Thursday. So that guy's coming back, and she had a cordial reception here in the context of an intellectual debate. So, but what happened at Claremont?
Yes, this was actually 2017, and I'm surprised that you gave her a cordial reception, given that according to the people protesting, she is notorious white supremacist fascist. Even though what she had certainly has some controversial views, but she's a mainstream, sharp-elbowed, controversial conservative, but on the grounds that she is a notorious white supremacist fascist, which, as far as I can tell, she ain't. What students did was they blocked the entrance to her speech so people could not get in. She did actually end up speaking. They live streamed it. So she spoke to an empty hall or a nearly empty hall with students banging on the windows while she was trying to speak. Whatever Q&A session they could have through the live stream was cut short, in part for this reason. And she was hustled out through a kitchen into an unmarked van like a witness against the mob. So that kind of thing certainly does happen. And I think it's deplorable. And McDonald continues to maybe not receive treatment on quite this level, but wherever she goes nowadays, maybe except for American University, there's a pretty good chance she's going to run into trouble. So at Emory, I think it was earlier this year, actually, in January 2020, she did speak, but not before somebody petitioned the student government on the grounds that her very presence was discriminatory. So she deals with that kind of thing. If I could get,
I've just been corrected. We didn't host her. Sorry, we hosted Megan McArdle.
different
So
character.
I got my Scottish names confused. My
It
bad.
must be the devil horns, right?
Yeah.
That is perplexing when people dress like that. If I could maybe get slide 6 to try to put this in a little bit of context. So, you know, we're told that incidents have grown over the years, and you can kind of track it. For the most part, they have anyway, right? This starts 2002. This is from, I mentioned the Foundation of Individual Rights in Education, and this is from their disinvitation database. And what they do with their disinvitation database is they're trying to track both actual disinvitations, right? So when students or outsiders or whoever succeed in getting somebody uninvited, they track that. They also track unsuccessful attempts to do so. And so these are all the attempts you see on this slide. And, you know, at least up until 2016, you could tell a story, you know, a compelling one that they were up. But in absolute terms, this is not a lot of disinvitations, right? So 2016 is the record year for these disinvitations. Let's recall that there were 4,500 colleges and universities. A lot of them have events. Many of them have many events on campus in any given week. And the record year, 2016, is 43 disinvitations. That's as high as it's gotten. Now, it is true, though, because I don't want to make nothing of it, that the more disinvitations you have, right, even if it's just going up, even if it's just doubling, right, the more you're thinking, if you're organizing a talk, I sometimes do organize talks, the more you're thinking about the problem of, well, you know, there seems to be a lot of protesting going on right now. What am I going to do if that happens? Well, I might need extra security. I've sometimes had to get extra security for a talk. That costs money. I might have to go to more meetings, you know, to plan a response just in case. something happens, and all these might be disincentives for me to invite somebody who's controversial, right, in some manner or another. So I think maybe you're thinking of inviting Bret Stephens, the New York Times columnist, but he gets a lot of flack. He's pretty controversial. Maybe somebody would show up and protest. So you probably should invite somebody bland with no profile who's kind of dull, right? Maybe me, right? If you can remember my name, go through your Rolodex, right? And invite that guy. I'm cheaper than Stephens also. It's how I get most of my speaking invitations. So I don't knock it in that sense. And I would add also, to put this in some more context, that students, sometimes backed by outside organizations, which have some money, are much less shy about inviting controversial speakers to campus. So, if you can get a $20,000 grant from Young Americans for Freedom, you can get Dinesh D'Souza, to come to Stanford or Notre Dame, or in this case, American University, right? 2018, he came, or Dartmouth, which I think is his alma mater, and he'll stand behind a podium and talk about how nobody lets him speak, right? So you do get controversial speakers onto campus in that way too. But I think there's an argument to be made that if that's your situation, right, if event organizers are frightened about inviting on controversial speakers, and those who aren't frightened of inviting in controversial speakers are mostly in it to own the libs, you're probably not leading your best free speech life. If I could say just one more thing about this, I said in the introduction that I don't think we know as much as we'd like to about what's going on in campus. I think disinvitations are one example. This disinvitation database is our primary resource, and I love it. It's fun to play around with, and you should check it out. But the way in which it's compiled is that a few people over at FIRE, right, that's their delightful acronym, they've got a Google alert, and they see what they can see. Sometimes people call into the office or lodge a complaint or contact them. So they've got things that come into the office, and those might make the database. That means, the things might be significantly undercounted. They might be overcounted. If you see a rise in the level of disinvitations, that might be because there's been a rise in the level of disinvitations. It might be because journalists are covering it more, so your Google alert picks up stuff more. It might be because more people know about FIRE, right? They were founded in 1999 and gradually became better known, so maybe more stuff comes into the office. Maybe some things come into the office and others don't, right? Maybe the people who are reporting fit a different profile. So one political scientist who writes a lot about this, Jeff Sachs, looked at the database and said, well, he thinks that incidents at religious colleges are actually undercounted in this database. So there are a lot of ambiguities here. Even in 2016, right, that's the record year, so it really stands out. That number might be a little bit misleading because 25% of all disinvitations that year were attempts to disinvite Milo Yiannopoulos, one speaker. So it's tricky. It's easy to get tricked. Right? I got tricked myself, right? It went down in 2018 drastically. And so Jeffrey Sachs wrote a piece about it. And so I said, see, it's getting better. But if you want to know what a V-shaped recovery looks like, that's what it looks like. So I was getting prepared to eat my words over this. I actually had put them in my mouth and was chewing when Jeffrey Sachs wrote another piece. If I could see the next slide. In which he points out that when you break down disinvitations from the right or the left of the speaker, right, attempts from the left are still down considerably from where they were. So what's going on? I mean, what does it mean? I mean, conservative attempts are up, but from what, 5 to 11, we're dealing with very small numbers, and so it's difficult to draw conclusions about it. We just don't know very much. That would be my take on that.
Okay, so let's go on to student opinion, because there's a lot of discussion that students today are less in favor of free speech. And I will just say anecdotally, I've been teaching John Stuart Mill's On Liberty for more than 25 years, probably 30 years. And when I first started teaching on liberty, I had to work hard to get the students to be interested in the argument of on liberty, because it just seems so obvious to them that you should let every opinion exist. But these days, there's several students who always object on the grounds of, what about hate speech? What about speech that makes people uncomfortable, or they feel attacked by? So what do we know about student opinion and free speech on campus?
Well, yeah, as I said in the introduction, I don't think you're making it up. So let's take a look, but I'll just preview it by saying that by the end of my comments, it will be revealed. I think there has been a genuine change in student opinion, that it's at least somewhat measurable, based on a very good survey that we've got, although I think it's still a little bit unclear what the meaning of that survey is precisely. But let's start with, can I get slide 8, please? I think it's the very next slide, actually. Yeah, this is the right slide. So this is a Cato Institute survey from 2017, so it's relatively recent. You can see on the slide how many people they asked. And one neat thing about this survey, not a lot of surveys do this, is it does compare people who are presently in college to people who are not. So it's not a huge survey, and I don't believe it's been repeated, at least these particular questions by Cato, but it's still an interesting piece of work that tells you a little bit more than a lot of surveys do, but is the kind of survey that makes people say that one of the problems with free speech on campus, just sort of kids today, right? And so they ask, and I want you to pay close attention to the question. This is not even now about whether, college administrators should intervene or anything like this. This is what the government should do. So what people should be allowed to do in public, like a public park, right, or something like that. That's what Cato is asking about here, and they're giving a couple of different alternatives, right? Either you can sort of say what you want, unpopular opinions that may be deeply offensive, right? Those are the terms that are used, or you prevent people from engaging in hate speech. And where deeply offensive seems to be the equivalent of hate speech, which is already pretty nebulous, especially when you're talking about government action. You can see that for students in college, this is a dead tie, right? They're really not sure about this. And for folks who are not in college, it looks a lot different. There's a dramatic difference between people who are currently in college. I think it's mostly traditional age college students that they're looking at there. And if I could see the next slide. Yeah, so it turns out, and this is something I don't think I would have predicted, but we're still looking at a question of what the laws are going to be, right? It ought to be a law, ought to be illegal to say offensive or insulting, right? So now this is the equivalent of hate speech, right? What's offensive or insulting? So that's getting still more nebulous. And college students, or people who are presently in college, are much more likely that there ought to be a law, much more likely to agree that there ought to be a law that you can't say offensive or insulting things about white people in public. So the difference is 17 points. It's not a majority who think that of students in college, but it's a much larger group who think that. And the same goes for the police.
30% of the non-college people say that.
What's that?
It's 30% of the non-college people say that about white people. The college students are 17% higher.
I guess if you do the math,
yeah,
that must be.
I'm just clarifying what the plus 17.
Yeah, so it's not a huge percentage, although even a third of the group saying that is interesting, right? Again, given the terminology used here, just offensive or insulting. And it really applies across the board. I've just given 4 examples, but in almost every category, whatever it is, right? Whether you think it's the kind of thing that somebody who's a conservative might be worried about or something a liberal might be worried about, college students are more likely in almost every case Sometimes the difference is quite small, probably statistically insignificant, right? But in almost every case, they lean more in the direction of saying there ought to be laws on the books enforceable against saying offensive and insulting things in public. So that seems worrying to me. But on the other hand, 69% of people in the same survey say, and this is further than I would go, that freedom of speech ensures that the truth will ultimately win out. These are the college students who say this. And I'm not sure if they asked the adult sample this, but this strikes me as a pretty high degree, right, of faith in the idea that if you've got freedom of speech, that means the truth will win. If I could see the next slide. I'm sorry, one more. So this is a Knight Foundation survey from the year before. We used to call it the Knight Museum survey, but the museum is no more, so we'll just say the Knight Foundation survey. And this one also actually helpfully performs the task of looking at U.S. college students and non-college students, though some of them might be the same age as college-age students. And they're asked a question very much like the Cato Institute question, except now it's about college campuses. What should be most important to colleges? Should they allow sort of an open environment, even if that means that there's going to be offensive speech, or should they try to have a positive learning environment, even if that means that you have to prohibit some kinds of speech? And the student sample is overwhelmingly in favor of the open environment, more so than the adult sample is in this case. So that's why I say it's a little bit tricky. So you'd see the next slide. Here's FIRE again, right? It's like an advertisement for FIRE. And this is, I actually think the date for this is clearly wrong. I don't know how it ended up that way. It's a 2018 survey. I guess I put the date of the lecture in the title for some reason. Don't remember doing that. But so the first two items, the kinds of things that, again, sort of make First Amendment people weep into their pocket constitutions. Colleges should be able to restrict political views that are, again, hurtful or offensive. That's why I say it's worrying. These are very vague standards. You know, and a pretty decent majority wants that. It's very important not to be part of a campus community, to be part of a campus community where I'm not even exposed to ideas that are offensive. But then also, very same survey, students should have a right to offensive speech, even if what they're saying offends others, right? What's going on there? And overwhelmingly, like the biggest number in the entire survey, white nationalists should be allowed to protest peacefully, right? So I think it's fair to say that students are of two minds about this kind of thing. We used to say that they're pretty good in general about free speech and not very good in specifics, but what that white nationalists should be allowed to protest peacefully tells you that even on some specific cases where you would expect them to say, no, of course that should be suppressed. They don't say that, at least on this, this FIRE survey. And that's another reason why I say we don't know much, right? We don't really know what this means, I think, about student opinion. If I get the next slide. So, you know, as I think most of, especially here at American University, most of us will know, surveys of which we really don't have that many on this issue are sensitive to things like question wording, context, and yeah, well, I guess mostly question wording and context are the two I want to talk about. Let me talk about context, and actually I'll skip the question wording, just talk about context. So the first thing I want to say about context is that Cato survey was fielded, I think actually during, or may have just started a couple of days after Heather Heyer was run down and killed at the Charlottesville protest. And that might have had an effect on what respondents had to say about free speech. First Amendment Center survey, this is a survey they've been running for quite a long time, and they ask the same question pretty much every year. Does the First Amendment go too far? And you see it's actually sort of all over the place. probably, 2002, that's September 11th. Probably. The people who explain the survey think that maybe 2014 is the Boston Marathon bombing, which had occurred the year before. But at least some questions you ask, and probably not all, you get quite a bit of context sensitivity. And so you see it go up and you might think there's a trend, but then it turns out that perhaps there isn't.
Okay, what about politicians? I want to move along a little bit so we can leave time for questions.
Well,
And
I'm willing to make the politicians part a bit briefer if I can describe
Okay.
the change that I really think has occurred with respect to student speech, because I think that's pretty important. So if you could just give me one more slide, and I promise I'll be brief. This is the Higher Education Research Institute survey, and they've been in business for over 50 years. They survey large numbers of students, first-year students. I think they got maybe 95,000 this year. So this is a much larger survey than any of the other surveys that we've looked at. I'll just look at this one question, even though there's one other free speech related question they asked too. This one is, colleges have a right to ban extreme speakers. Do you strongly or somewhat agree with that statement? And the blue, I broke it down by gender for some reason, but the blue is the one you really have to pay attention to. That is the general question. You see, I mean, they start out back in the 60s. It's pretty high. It's somewhere in the 30s. Pretty quickly it drops into the low to mid 20s. 25% agreeing. And then they stopped asking for a while. They stopped asking in 1986. I don't know if they were upset about the Mets' victory in the World Series and dropped it, but they finally got around to asking again in 2004. And there had been a really big change, right? From the mid-20s to the 40s, where it stuck. In other words, it wasn't a change that happened and then went right down, but it stuck there for quite some time in the low to mid 40s. And then it's leapt up again pretty recently, and we'll see if that's a long-term trend or not. But I do think it would be fair to say, Alan, this may be one thing that you're experiencing, that students genuinely do come in thinking rather differently. If this survey is any indication, it's the best survey, I think, of the ones we've gone over so far. Maybe they do think a bit differently about free speech issues than they did before. Yeah. So I will.
So in that 20 years, yeah, in that 20 years, something happened. Do you know what? Do you have a guess?
I don't. I mean, because you can't even pinpoint when it happened. So how can you really guess, right? It could have happened over a couple of years and stuck. It could have happened late and stuck. It might have happened gradually. That gap in data means that's hard, I think, even to hazard a guess about it. All we sort of know is that there's been some kind of change in attitude with respect to this question and whatever it might be capturing.
Okay, so let's go on to politicians sticking their nose on campus and limiting free speech. What's going on with that?
Yeah, so I think this is a little different than the others, because it tends to be a worry about outside influences on campus more so than students and what they're doing. And I'm going to focus on something that's actually fairly close to my heart. I've been really involved in fighting in various ways the Boycott Israel movement, both on campus and off. And so I think my concerns about what I'm going to talk about, I think, and therefore maybe be taken more seriously than if I were to talk about other matters one could talk about. I visited the University of Houston in 2018 to talk about actually free speech on campus. And in order to speak there, I had to sign a document that said that I was not, as a contractor, but there's really no differentiation between me as a contractor, right, and just me. I do have to file, as a business, but really it's just me. Had to sign a document that said, no, I'm not involved in this boycott of Israel. I'm not doing it, right? I'm not boycotting Israel. So when I buy my candy bar, at the airport, I'm not boycotting Israel. And, I didn't mind signing that. I signed it with a flourish because I'm against the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which is the main non-governmental arm of the boycott movement. Since then, the Texas law has been at least partly overturned. They had to rewrite it to exclude individual proprietors like me. But I did wonder at the time, what about an individual proprietor who did favor that movement? What would happen to that person? I guess that person would either have to lie or not speak. And something like that did happen earlier this year. I mean, 32 states have passed laws that are somewhat like the one that Texas has. Some apply to individual proprietors, some don't. Georgia still has one that does. And Abby Martin, who I don't love for a variety of reasons, but still, earlier this year was going to speak at Georgia Southern University. Georgia Southern has one of those laws. And she's pro-BDS, and she didn't feel as if she could sign it, and she did not speak there. And in fact, they canceled the conference of which she was a part over the stuff. So I'm sort of focusing on the boycott, divestment, and sanctions thing because I'm usually on the side of people who are fighting the boycott, but I do worry about strategies like this where the overall effect is going to be to prevent speakers from speaking. Let me give you at least one other example in the same vein. One of the things that first started me writing about higher education was an incident that happened in Brooklyn College 2013, and it also concerned the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. The political science department, along with a bunch of activist groups, it sponsors an event in which Omar Barghouti, who co-founded the movement, and Judith Butler, the sort of academic intellectual star of the movement, were coming to Brooklyn College for what was billed, even by supporters of the event, as a kind of activist strategy session with something of a recruitment element. Come here and find out why you ought to join our effort. Now, I didn't think that the political science department should sponsor such an event for a variety of reasons, but something else happened at that time, which is the New York City Council got involved. And they said the following: we believe in the principle of academic freedom. However, we also believe in the principle of not supporting schools whose programs we and our constituents find to be wrong and odious, they added. A significant portion of the funding for CUNY, they pointed out, comes directly from the tax dollars of New York. So, in other words, they're all for academic freedom, but nice university you've got, there would be a pity if anything were to happen to it. Yeah, where the overall effect was they tried to get the university to disinvite these people. And in the end, it wasn't a successful effort, but legislators being involved in that kind of effort bothers me on First Amendment grounds, because again, the overall effect is preventing speakers from speaking.
All right, so Jonathan, I want to move now to some more theoretical questions because we are the Political Theory Institute, and this is our Constitution Day lecture, okay? So I want to talk about what should be the policy of free speech on campus and how we should think about free speech on campus. But since this is our Constitution Day lecture, let's start with the First Amendment and the First Amendment on campus, and then what other thoughts you have. And let me just remind the audience here to submit your questions in the chat feature. And it is our tradition to take questions from students first. So students and alums out there, please make sure you get your questions in, and then we'll move on to everyone else.
Thank you. So, yeah, so the problem with a First Amendment rationale, certainly as it applies to private universities, is that private universities aren't state actors, and they're not covered by the First Amendment. They might have language in their handbooks over which they can be sued, but they're not covered by the First Amendment. They don't need to abide by it. So at least private universities are placed in a position where they have to consider what kinds of norms or regulations suit places like theirs, given their specific aims, which at most colleges and universities, to use a shorthand, have something to do with pursuing the truth and the cultivation of judgment in their students and the transmission of knowledge. the First Amendment is mostly, though not wholly, designed to prevent government action, right? And in a way, college administrative action, while can have effect on an individual campus, is not quite as worrisome. So colleges tend to look to other justifications, though they sometimes use that one to justify having an open atmosphere in campus. And the most popular argument, the one I most often see cited by people who write about this kind of thing, is John Stuart Mill's argument from his 1859 book on liberty. And what Mill says is that something like, he allows some regulations later on in the book, but something like an untrammeled openness to different opinions is essential to pursuit of the truth. And he does make an argument for this. He says that we are partial beings. We tend to mistake a part of the truth for the whole of it. This is just sort of the way we are. We're natural partisans. Mill's not alone in making this argument. John Locke says much earlier in the 17th century that we see but in part and we know but in part. And it's no wonder that we judge, now I'm paraphrasing, that we judge wrong because of this partiality. So the remedy for Mill, the only thing that saves us from disaster, right, from Mill's standpoint, is that we're able to correct ourselves, right, our corrigibility. But he suggests that the only way we can really correct ourselves is by being exposed to just about every species of opinion and way of thinking about things that are available to us. And sometimes if one's not available, we might have to resurrect it, by playing devil's advocate or something like that. So that's the argument, right? If you're in a university trying to create an atmosphere in which the truth can be pursued and judgment can be cultivated, you just have to make room for every variety of opinion. But I think there are problems even with that argument when you're dealing with colleges and universities. It does make universities look kind of like a public park, so you can have the deplorables handing out leaflets in one corner and the resistance laying out leaflets in another, and we pick them up and we try to figure out what's going on, quite as if the university's only duty with respect to its students was to kind of usher them into the presence of clashing opinions and say, go play, and out of that set of clashing opinions, you'll figure out what's what. And even Mill doesn't think that it works that way, right? He says that actually when you have this openness, what happens is that people get much more partisan quite often. He says, and I'm quoting here, I acknowledge the tendency of all opinions to become more sectarian is not cured by the freest discussion, but is often exacerbated or heightened. And then he adds, it's not on the impassioned partisan, it's on the calmer and more disinterested bystander that the collision of opinions works its salutary, its healthy effect, right? So from that perspective, if you bring those two speakers as described on campus, the effect for most of us is that we'll be foaming at the mouth just a little bit more than we were the day before, but maybe a disinterested observer like Levine here, right?
And our students,
might be standing around with a clipboard saying, "Yeah, well, that's really quite interesting." And it's no surprise that students maybe reject this as a viable educational model. You need to think. I think colleges and universities need to think a lot harder about whether we know how to shape these calmer and more disinterested bystanders that Mill has in mind. But that's almost completely off the radar in our debate about these matters, which have almost entirely to do with what a regulation should be, who gets to speak, who doesn't get to speak under what circumstances.
So what should we be doing?
What's that?
What should we be doing?
Well, I think that the first thing is that we need to recognize that skepticism about this argument is warranted and understandable. A lot of discourse is really pretty bad, right? So you turn on the TV or you look at Twitter, and what you see is pundits, politicians, and other people who for some reason have taken up the stance as press secretary for position X or Y are making arguments in bad faith in order to get the better of the people that they're dealing with. This is, in a way, I think, our primary experience of discourse about important matters in a lot of ways. And so, why wouldn't you think, coming onto campus, maybe it wouldn't be so bad if some of these people were just kind of a little bit made to shut up, right? Because it doesn't seem valuable. So I think, your first concern has to be ushering students into a kind of community, which universities often say that they are, even if they're made up of a gazillion neighborhoods, but certainly small colleges say that they are communities of people who are seeking the truth in some manner or another, prepared to follow arguments where they go, prepared to agree, even if they are, you don't have to be completely dispassionate, right? But you agree that, whatever your passions are, if you're faced with a conflict between your passionately held argument and the evidence, the other arguments that you have in front of you, that you'll yield, at least eventually. John Locke, I guess I'll just be talking about Locke and Mill. He talks in some thoughts concerning education about, what you might call a reasonable person. And he says that, there can't be anything so misbecoming anyone who pretends to be a rational creature as not to yield to plain reason and the conviction of clear arguments.
Just say that again, the Locke line.
There cannot be anything so misbecoming, so unbecoming, so inappropriate, right? There cannot be anything so misbecoming anyone who pretends to be a rational creature as not to yield to plain reason and the conviction of clear arguments, right? So this is the kind of member of this community, right, is the kind of person who's not going to stick doggedly, again, like a press secretary or a person on the debate team. I was on the debate team, so I understand the allure of that, right? But who's not going to stick to an argument long after the grounds for that argument have dissolved. So I think that there's a set of dispositions and virtues that go along with that, and that colleges and universities have to be upfront about that kind of thing. They ought to lead with that, and they ought to consider themselves as shapers, right, of students in one way or another to be part of that kind of community.
So modeling how to learn and teaching students how to learn.
Well, in a way, I think that's a little too pat. I mean, I think it's true, right? In other words, that's descriptive. But we often, you might think, well, colleges are already doing that. They say people are learning, right? And they talk about critical thinking, which sounds a little bit like reason. But what Locke is certainly talking about, and I think this would also be appropriate in a community like the one Mill describes too, right, at least up to a point, is an idea about what's honorable and dishonorable, right? There can be nothing so misbecoming. It's a disgrace, right? A disgrace not to yield to plain reason the conviction of clear arguments. Right, that's a little bit more, I think, than just, well, we're going to teach you how to learn. You'll be lifelong learners, right? That's something that that colleges will often say. I was talking to some of your students earlier in the day, and I think you're competing with different kinds of shame cultures, so to speak, right, on campus. According to one, what's shameful is not to, what's shameful is being too serious about stuff, right? Being too serious about class, being too earnest, right? And so you should instead be ironic. That's one side, but then there's also, right, the side that's much more prominent now, I think, which is more emphatically political, which is that you should feel ashamed and disgraced, right? If even in an effort to support intellectual community, you put people in a position in which they might be offended. So, there's no question, people aren't shameless, right? You do have these different competing claims, and I think that colleges and universities need to make a claim about the virtues and dispositions that are appropriate for the kind of community they're trying to construct.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a good place to end. I believe we have some questions. And Gabe, would you like to, can you start reading some questions for us?
Yes, I will be happy to, if you can hear me.
Yes.
And as discussed, I'll be doing it from behind the veil here.
And that is John
Okay.
Locke.
Yes, so it's
a little,
appropriate.
little eerie.
The ghost of John Locke.
Yes, well, next time I'll switch to John Stuart Mill for you. Okay, so we've got quite a few questions from students. I will start with just a recently graduated AU Poli-Sci student, Thomas McGarry, and he asks, he says, there seems to be a narrative that higher education turns students into radical leftists, but it seems that most progressive students already arrive on campus with those views. So if students are the main purveyors of the suppression of speakers and rescinding invitations, that sort of thing, then how much of the problem, to the extent that there is one, rests in pre-secondary education, in your opinion? And how much of a role does the government play in public high school or middle school's curriculum?
Thank you, Thomas, for that question. I'm going to start by nibbling around its edges just a little bit, and note. So it's true that at least some social scientists who have studied this phenomena have made that claim, right? That what's happening on campuses is less that students are being indoctrinated by professors in classrooms, which is the way people talk about what's going on, but instead they're learning from their peer group. Which is relatively speaking more liberal than the general non-college going population. The way I want to nibble around that a little bit is that I don't think that students coming in are exactly, hotbeds of radical activism. So, I mentioned the Higher Education Research Institute Survey. They survey 95,000 people. We're at something of a peak right now, I think you could argue, of sort of political excitement. So if you're going to see a lot of people coming in as hardened progressive activists, this is kind of where you'd expect it. And last year, 2019, which is the last year that we have figures available, maybe 4.5% of students surveyed describe themselves as the far left. A lot more describe themselves as liberal, and we're trying to deal with, these are self-identifications here, so we don't really know what's underneath them. But if you kind of tally up the people who consider themselves on the far right, and these numbers I don't have ready to hand, but not many. Conservatives, still not many, though many more than you have on the faculty, I think. And middle of the roaders, they outnumber self-described liberals and far leftists about 60-40. Now, this is on a wide range of campuses, and it's a national sample. And if you looked at, private, non-sectarian colleges, it would look a bit different. But it wouldn't support the idea that what's happening is that there are a bunch of radical progressives who come onto campus and then sort of turn other people who are there into radical progressives. That just doesn't seem to be the way that things fall out. So in that sense, I worry a little bit about the premise of the question. As for pre-K through 12, it's such a varied mix of schools you're dealing with, and there are so many regional differences. I realize that, you do have schools of education, right, that train teachers in a certain way, but there's such wide variance from district to district, region to region, place to place, that I'm not sure that it would be promising to that the hypothesis that it's elementary, middle school, and high school teachers that are performing an indoctrination, even though certainly some of that occurs, right? You can find examples of it. It's not too hard.
All right, thank you. On to our next question from another AU student, Parita Gavil. And she says, from my experience and from what I've heard from my college peers, this is an issue that when somebody says something that isn't deemed politically correct or something that's insensitive, they're harassed or silenced. And she shares a personal anecdote. I served on a pre-law organization's executive board and was creating a graphic on the California wildfires and the ethics of using prisoners as the frontline firefighters. In academia today, we still use language like felon, prisoner, convict, and criminal, but I was told that I would be censored since it was offensive or not in accord with social justice. And instead, we need to say a person who committed a felony or people who have been incarcerated, in terms like that are more neutral. So do you think that maybe we don't hear enough about this issue because of the shame around it and emphasis on safetyism and conforming to certain standards of public discourse? And if that's the case, what can be done to teach college students to be more receptive of differing views and to proceed with civility in such matters?
Hey, what did you say the name of the questioner was?
Parita.
Oh, Parita, thank you. So, you know, Alan mentioned I write for Commentary Magazine about higher education, so I've certainly flagged a lot of instances of this kind of thing over the years, I think. So I'm not going to say that it's not a real thing or that this didn't actually happen to you, or that my students who come to me and say, you know, I feel suppressed because, you know, I want to wear my MAGA hat, but I think if I do it, people are going to yell at me, right, on campus. I don't think any of that isn't true, right? But it kind of goes back to the crisis, the problem language that was encouraged me to use before. So do we hear enough about it? I actually think we hear quite a bit about it, right? That is to say that you know, it is not just among conservatives either, right? Conventional wisdom that this kind of practice you're describing is extremely widespread, right? Such that a student asked me, I think in the previous session, you know, isn't it true that colleges are now more or less indoctrination factories? And I think that, again, if not that surveys tell you everything, I don't think they do, and you'd really want to actually, you know, talk to a lot of students and see how they elaborate on their answers. But the Heterodox Academy, which has every interest in finding out, that is, they really want to know, every interest in finding out if students feel suppressed on campus, did a survey in 2019, I think, so it's just last year, a recent survey, and they asked them across different categories, and this is mostly about speech in class, but that's often what we're talking about. Do you feel, you know, very comfortable, somewhat reluctant, or very reluctant talking about various issues? And they're the kinds of issues that people are, you know, usually pretty uncomfortable talking about, not just if they're on campus, but if they're sitting around a Thanksgiving table with members of their own family. So these are things like race, like gender. They use the general category of politics as well. And the other one is religion. And you know, we find out something from this survey that's helpful to know, and I think goes along with the question, which is, you know, there are a substantial number of people who feel either somewhat or very reluctant to speak about these issues in class, you know, even among liberals. And there are many more among conservatives who feel reluctant to speak about these kinds of issues in class. For the most part, interestingly, maybe because people who are very conservative have sort of given up on being loved. They indicate being, you know, about the same level of reluctance as people who just describe themselves as conservative on some of these matters. But the point I want to make is just that, you know, if you look at these issues, the people who describe themselves as very reluctant, and I feel like this is what you have to worry about most, that people are so reluctant that maybe they won't speak at all. Whereas if I'm somewhat reluctant, and I'm somewhat reluctant all the time about almost everything, right? So if I'm somewhat reluctant, that's a problem. but it's probably not a crisis. If I'm very reluctant, really large numbers, that might be a crisis. Conservatives and very conservative students don't break 10%, I don't think, across any of these categories. Maybe 11, maybe 12. But it's not a high percentage. It's too many, I think, but it's not a high percentage of students who describe themselves as very reluctant to speak up in class, nor is it a majority, when you add in somewhat reluctant. But I think the very reluctant category is one you sort of want to focus on when you're thinking in crisis terms, as opposed to that which just makes it more difficult to have a discussion in class sometimes.
Okay, Gabe, let's take a few more student questions and then open it up.
All right. So I have a simple question from Jonah Kaufman-Cohen, who is also an AU undergrad. He says, I'm wondering how many of those attempted disinvitations recorded by fire are actually successful. Do they apply a high bar to these attempts, or are they on a hair trigger?
That's a good question. So the short answer is, I've never looked across all of the years, but at years I've looked at, it's tended to be half successful. Now, they deal with a lot of different kinds of controversies. So, in fact, many of the controversies they dealt with early in their career had to do with graduation speakers. And there you might think, well, maybe it's not so bad that graduation speaker X was disinvited. It's not really, a place where you're doing, debate and argument and so on. It's an honor that you're providing. But nonetheless, so I think even when you get down to number how many are successful, it gets tricky. You have to look and see, well, okay, what kind of disinvitation attempt are we dealing with? And in terms of the hair trigger question, sometimes yes, sometimes no. In other words, it has to do with the procedure that they use for collecting events. So if you're kind of looking through Google Alerts and, the person who's doing it, right, in year 2 is different from the person who's doing it in year 1, you might have somewhat different triggers. So I've sometimes added things to the database. You can call up and do that, say, well, does this qualify? They'll say, yeah, it does, and they'll put it on. But sometimes that's no more than 5 or 6 people wrote a letter saying, I really think you should disinvite this person, which doesn't strike me as all that worrisome. Whereas, if I see a massive faculty effort to shut things down, that worries me a little bit more.
All right. And Owen Rosenberg asks, speaking of public forums, and given that you've discussed this in the excerpt that was assigned for students, what role do you think that social media companies should be playing in the conversation regarding free speech? Are these forums or publishers?
Yeah, that question is maybe a little too hard for me, actually. I think that, a lot hinges on whether you consider Facebook something like monopoly, right? That matters. But, when you think about the way in which things have been exacerbated by social media, there's certainly a greater ease of, first of all, finding people who think like you may have not been able to find in your own neighborhood. Another effect is you're able to reach a large number of people pretty quickly. Some people argue that Facebook actually boosts incendiary material through its algorithm and regard that as irresponsible. But in some ways, it's like any other medium of communication, right? So people send incendiary stuff through the mail. In the 19th century, people wanted to stop abolitionists from doing that. The mail is a tool for spreading bad info. The TV is a tool of that kind. And people who want to fight the spread of misinformation, so sort of like how hackers get very good at hacking and people who are opposing them get very good at stopping them. I think, regardless of what happens to Facebook, really have to get much better at fighting on social media with the tools they have available to them. I'd say I'm a little bit leery in part because Facebook just seems so bad at it. Having them look too closely at kicking people off over the kinds of things that they're trying to promulgate on there, because they seem to capture in their net all kinds of people, including people who are protesting against that kind of speech and misinformation. Maybe they could get better at it. I'm not sure. In the end, I think they are a private company, and although they have a lot of power, people are able, as when many people on the alt-right fled Twitter, right, for another company, can find other places to congregate. If you were to get Facebook to behave in a more reliable manner to deal with misinformation, you know, there's still platforms like WhatsApp. I feel like it's something of a whack-a-mole effort that you're dealing with, and so the main work is to get as good at using these mediums as the people who are misusing them are good at it.
Next question for you is calls for a little bit of literary analysis or textual analysis. Anna Lim asks, what do you think John Stuart Mill meant by the beliefs which we have most warrant for have no safeguard to rest upon, but a standing invitation to the whole world to prove them unfounded?
It's graduate exams all over again. Thank you for that question. So, you know, one thing I think he has in mind, and this is really the hardest case, is that, you know, sometimes Mill thinks that we do get to a pretty high degree of certainty about some things. That is to say, precisely because we're in a position to be corrected, we do get better in some regards, right? We start off at a position of knowing less and end up in a position of knowing more. And getting things closer and closer to a level of something like 100%, if not quite 100% certainty. But, you know, I ask my class, we used to teach Galileo's dialogue on world systems in our freshman seminar. And one of the things that's discussed is whether the Earth really rotates, right, about which, you know, some people had some doubt. And it did turn out that if you made an argument about the Earth, about how ridiculous it was to think that the Earth rotated, students tended not to be all that good at answering that kind of argument. You know, it was something that they thought they knew, but in some sense they didn't really know, because they couldn't explain why it was true. So I think that there are a lot of beliefs like that from Mill's standpoint become, you know, sort of flabby, dead, and, you know, in some respects, how can you really say you know it, right, if you couldn't show it? I didn't mean to make that rhyme, but there it is.
Okay, Gabe, let's open it up. Do we have any other questioners besides students?
Well, I have one question here from Professor Borden Flanagan, which I can read for him, or we can, would you like me to go ahead with it?
Yeah. Borden, are you there? Do you want to ask it directly? And if not, I think Borden's on his iPhone.
Can you hear me?
Great.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. So, hi, Jonathan. Welcome. Nice to have you here. I'm sorry that you haven't given us new gods to worship. That's the PR that I sent out on Twitter.
I was most excited about hitting you with a pipe, but I couldn't figure
right.
it out.
Yeah. I figured you'd like that. Yeah. So the question is, maybe one of the reasons why this is taken to be a conservative issue is that isn't there kind of an asymmetry in the kinds of objections that are made between left and right, in that from the left, you have a more theoretical and more comprehensive critique of the grounds of free speech altogether. So you'll have criticisms from the right about specific speakers, but on the left, you also have a new ground of limiting speech articulated in the form of a wider, more expansive understanding of harm. So I guess my first question is, do you think this is the case? Is there a more radical critique of the grounds of free speech coming from efforts to silence speakers from the left or from the left generally? And then secondly, or do you find something like that coming from the right as well? And maybe more importantly, should we take that theoretical critique seriously and rethink what we think of in terms of harm that justifies speech limitations?
Thank you, Borden. I can't believe I was thinking of hitting you with a pipe, because that's a good question.
Someone's going to have to tell me where all this violence is coming from.
It's Borden's advertising for this talk on Twitter.
Look, you didn't know Jonathan back at the Committee on Social Thought at Chicago. He was a dangerous figure. I mean, he seems mild-mannered now, but you know, Jonathan the pipe.
Yeah.
I don't think I could have taken Borden without the help of a pipe, but yeah, I did fight dirty. Speaking of harm, right? So, yeah. So let me say a couple of things about that. And I think there is an asymmetry that has to do with the prominence of the argument about compassion and harm. I think I can't remember exactly what Jonathan Rauch calls in his book Kindly Inquisitors, but it's something like, he calls it something like vindictive compassion or something like that. So there's a great concern, right, about harm being done to people who are not in a position to defend themselves against the harm that's being done to them. And I'll get to the question about whether to take that seriously or not in just a moment. But, you know, I think in a way, I think in a way you get, coming from the right side of the spectrum, a criticism that's at least as radical. And I want to talk right now about academic freedom, which I think is related, right, at least to the question of free speech. And the example I have actually has to do with a speaker that you're having coming in, I think a couple of speakers from now, Patrick Deneen. So this goes all the way back to 2014. I said at the beginning of the talk, there's a funny tendency where an undergraduate writes something and then it becomes national news, especially when they're at Harvard. And that happened, I think, in 2014, when an undergraduate by the name of Sandra Korn penned an article that said, I forget what her exact phrase was, but it was something like, you know, academic freedom, no, academic justice, yes, right? Something like that. And her argument there was that, you know, things like academic freedom, I feel quite confident she would extend it to free speech norms, or they're just kind of cloaks, right? They look equal, but they're actually status quo preserving, because the people who have power within the institution are always going to be capable of using it when they need to use it, and abandoning it when they can get away with abandoning it. So they just use academic freedom to shield themselves from criticisms. Sandra Korn regards universities, as many people on the left do, not as friendly places, but as bastions of neoliberalism and capitalism that have to be, in some manner or another, revolutionized or overturned or something like that. So Patrick Deneen, who is certainly a conservative, was one of many conservatives who wrote in to take issue with Korn. But unlike most conservatives at the time, he said, I agree with Sandra Korn. And what he agreed with her about was that academic freedom was a neutral thing, supposedly. There was actually a kind of Trojan horse from the people he says actually rule the university, namely, you know, progressives, globalists. I don't think he would use that language, but people like that who talk about academic freedom when they need to defend themselves from the outside world, but have no regard for it whatsoever when they're on the inside and able to exercise power. And I think Deneen would argue that's also actually in the outside world too, right, where the progressives are more or less in charge And so their appeals to either free speech or academic freedom are more or less empty. And he thinks that you do need an idea of academic justice governing the university, some set of values that the university stands for, other than liberalism, which he thinks has failed. Right, he'll be talking about that, I think, at his session. And so he just thinks that the values that guide the university should be different from the ones that Sandra Korn wants to guide the university. And you know, he thinks the fight is to have fewer social justice U's and more Catholic U's, or something like that. So I think there's a real parallel between the arguments, even though Deneen's doesn't have much to do with harm, which I think does have a real effect and does have to be taken seriously. In other words, I think that, but I think free speech advocates certainly nowadays do take it pretty seriously. So they don't deny that words can be very painful, sometimes more painful than being punched in the nose, or maybe even being hit by a pipe sometimes, depending on the words and you know, how sustained they are. And free speech advocates like Nadine Strassen, for example, former head of the ECLU, you know, think that has to be taken seriously, but at the same time argue that hate speech codes of the sort that used to be, I think they're less prominent in universities actually as codes nowadays that people want, don't do much to deal with that harm. They tend to be counterproductive. They tend to be turned against the people that they're supposed to protect, and they introduce a serious danger, which he associates mostly with the government, but also with university officials, which is that if you give them a power to use and the standard that they get to use in exercising is quite vague, like hate speech, that's giving them a power that's excessive and dangerous and can lead to the suppression of all kinds of political speech and all kinds of ideas, which from both a political and an academic perspective, she worries about. But she thinks it's quite wrong to say sticks and stones will break, may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. She doesn't think that's true. I think that students of the sort, I was talking to in a free speech class a while back, they were presented with the spectacle of neo-Nazis marching through a neighborhood in which Holocaust survivors lived. And, they kind of said, well, they shouldn't watch, or they should just suck it up. And actually, I don't think that's really a plausible position, right? You can't ignore that speech causes people pain. You can't ignore that some people are in a better position to defend themselves than others are. But advocates like Strassen and Erwin Chemerinsky and Howard Gilman, who wrote Free Speech on Campus, Nadine Strassen's recent book is called Hate. I think they're both very good books. Say that free speech has, traditionally been a very effective tool for defending people who are not in a position of power. So I'll subside there.
Okay, let me, we're past our official time. Let me just ask you for a final question that's sort of a summary, if you will, about what message you want all of us to come away with, and especially for university administrators, if there are any out there watching this. I know one of the PTI colleagues has just been hired in the provost's office, and so what would you want university administrators to take away and regular citizens to take away from your talk?
Well, I think the main thing that, well, those are two different groups. But let's start with the let's start with the administrators. So I think I'd go back to what I said earlier in my talk, which you characterize as teaching people to learn, but which I tried to argue was something a little bit more robust. I think colleges have to do a much better job leading with that sort of thing. On average, some of them do, some of them don't. Some of them make it a part of orientation, some of them don't. Some of them talk about this kind of thing a fair bit. Some of them barely talk about it at all. But I think in a way, it's the first line, or should be the first line of I wouldn't even call it defense exactly, but the first line to roll out when you're confronted with a group of people who are, say, asking you to take down a monument, for example, or to suppress a kind of speech that, well, this is an important question, right? And it is, right? Who we honor and who we dishonor is an important question. We don't often think about our monuments and statues. It's not a bad thing to think about. Here's how we should think about it as an intellectual community of the kind I described. University administrations have been very reactive, I think, especially in the recent past, to even the whiff of a hint of protest. They've rushed out statements and programs with, I think, little to no review as to whether they work or not. They've recommended various bestsellers. If you just whip them off the shelf and say, well, read this. And I think that that's almost exactly the wrong approach. I'd add that just because they whip the books off of the shelf, they've tended to put themselves in the position of recommending a certain kind of politics, which I think exacerbates the problem. Because, you know, there's no question that not just now, but from time immemorial, that in great matters of public discussion, a torrent of angry and malignant passions will be let loose, you know, in those matters. And that makes it very difficult for a college community, especially if it you know, takes it up and says, yes, let's take a stand with these couple of books or whatever it is, right, in this quarrel, makes it that much more difficult to manage to discuss these matters on college campuses. So that's for administrators, and you know, I'd love to see it be a kind of orientation thing. I'd love to see it, you know, let's be reasonable, especially because, you know, I'm trying to sell a book by that title, emblazoned on every banner. Let it be the academic religion of your college or university, right? Something like that. And yeah, I think for non-administrators, you know, it's that's everybody else. So still one message isn't going to do, but I really would urge a lot of, and again, this isn't just conservatives. It's also, you know, liberals and people who regard themselves as middle of the road, and their sole acquaintance with campus, at least since they've been on there, right, is these stories that they read, which I do think often capture real things that are going on, but are grossly exaggerated. And that's the whole picture of what's going on college campuses. I don't think it's in the end an accurate picture. I think that it's distorted. So you can still send your kids to college, is my message for others. And it needn't necessarily be Hillsdale, though there's nothing wrong with that either.
Right. Okay. Well, Jonathan, thank you very much for joining us. I thank you to the audience for joining us. I wish we were going out to dinner afterwards and I could find out what about your pipe smashing past, but I'll have to call it right here. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Hope
you,
to see you
everyone.
next week.